The bus door folded open with a tired hiss. I stood on the edge of the highway in my graduation dress, holding a thin envelope with my name written in my mother's handwriting. Behind me, my parents were already walking back toward the parking lot. My sister laughed as she clicked the remote. The Mercedes lights blinked twice. No one explained anything. My father didn't look back. My mother only said, "You'll figure it out." The way people do when they've already decided your place in their story. Cars rushed past. Wind lifted the hem of my gown. I stepped onto the bus while my sister slid into leather seats, her gift waiting with a bow. Inside the envelope was $20 and a bus route. I sat down, pressed my forehead to the glass, and noticed the missed calls on my phone. From a number I hadn't saved yet. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever been quietly erased from your own family story? My name is Amanda. That day was supposed to be about degrees, photos, and polite applause. Instead, I was riding a public bus in a borrowed gown, watching my reflection shake in the window while my parents drove away with my sister. I didn't cry. I opened my email, and that's when I saw the subject line. I had always been the practical one, not the loud achiever, not the golden child, just the daughter who handled paperwork, made schedules, filled forms, and stayed out of the way. My parents called it being responsible. My sister called it having no personality. I worked 2 campus jobs while finishing my post-graduation credits. I paid for my own books. I sent part of every paycheck home because my mother said things were tight again. I proofread my father's business emails. I helped my sister rehearse interviews she never prepared for. They praised her confidence. They relied on my silence. At family gatherings, I poured drinks. I cleared plates. I smiled when relatives asked what I planned to do next, and my mother answered for me. She's still figuring things out. No one ever asked what I had already built. They assumed I was behind because I wasn't broadcasting progress. Meanwhile, my sister posted pictures from cafes and boutiques. My parents reposted them with captions about supporting dreams. When I sent screenshots of my project milestones, my mother replied with a thumbs-up emoji. So I stopped sharing. I kept my meetings private. My contracts stayed in cloud folders under neutral file names. Even the bank alerts went to a silent email address. Not because I was hiding, because I'd learned that visibility inside our family came with conditions. If you succeeded quietly, it didn't count. If you struggled publicly, you were supported. That was the pattern. And I fit neatly into the role they'd assigned me, until that bus ride forced me to realize something else had been happening beneath the surface. Something I hadn't questioned yet. The first sign wasn't the Mercedes. It was the seating chart at the post-graduation luncheon. My name was printed at the far end of the table, beside 2 distant relatives I barely knew. My sister was centered between my parents, already posing for photos with her gift key in hand. I noticed the way my mother adjusted her jacket, so the car logo stayed visible in every frame. No one asked why I wasn't in the pictures. Later, while guests circulated, my father pulled me aside and handed me the envelope. "Just take the bus," he said quietly. "We're tight on space." Space. There were 3 empty seats in that car. I looked past him and saw my sister laughing, already live streaming. My mother nodded once, as if this were an administrative detail, not a decision about her daughter. I didn't argue. I walked away. On the bus, my phone vibrated again. Same unknown number. This time an email followed. Wire transfer confirmed. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I watched my parents' social posts go live. Hashtags about proud moments, captions about family support. The comments, filled with congratulations, directed entirely at my sister. I wasn't tagged. That should have hurt more than it did. What unsettled me was how coordinated it all felt. The timing, the photos, the way my absence created more room for her story. It wasn't impulsive. It was arranged. And as the bus merged into traffic, I realized this wasn't just about favoritism anymore. They had already decided who mattered. I just hadn't understood the cost of that decision yet. I didn't go straight home. I got off the bus 3 stops early and walked into a quiet cafe near the stadium. I ordered tea I didn't drink and opened my laptop. The email was exactly 1 sentence long. Funds received. Closing complete. No emojis. No congratulations. Just confirmation. 9 figures had settled into an account under a holding company my parents didn't know existed. I closed the laptop. Across the cafe, A television replayed graduation footage. Students in gowns. Families cheering. Somewhere in that crowd, my sister was probably rehearsing how she'd tell people the car was a surprise. My phone rang. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, my sister texted, "We're heading to the stadium now. Dad said you'll find your own way." No question mark. No concern. They assumed compliance. That assumption followed me into every room of my childhood. I was the adjustable one. The quiet filler. The background support system that didn't require acknowledgement. So I didn't announce my deal. I didn't correct their narrative. I didn't interrupt their celebration. I ordered another tea and forwarded the transfer confirmation to my attorney with 2 words. Proceed quietly. Then I checked the event program on the university site. My name was there. Not just listed. Highlighted. Valedictorian. I hadn't told my family because I hadn't needed to. They hadn't noticed because they hadn't looked. Outside, traffic thickened around the stadium. Inside the cafe, my phone kept vibrating with photos from my parents' group chat. My sister beside the Mercedes, my mother clasping her shoulders, my father shaking hands with people who thought they understood our family. They were building a story without me. What they didn't know was that in less than an hour, that story was going to meet an audience. I walked the remaining blocks to the stadium alone. Families streamed past me carrying balloons and flowers. Parents adjusted collars. Grandparents argued about seating. Everyone moved with purpose, pulled forward by shared milestones. I blended in, just another graduate without a cheering section. For a moment, I wondered if I had made it all too quiet. If maybe I should have pushed harder to be seen. If letting myself become invisible had made this easier for them. Silence, after all, teaches people what they're allowed to take. Inside, I found a seat near the aisle. My sister was already in the VIP section with my parents. My mother kept checking her phone. My father pointed toward the stage, explaining something animatedly to a man I didn't recognize. They still hadn't noticed me. I replayed small moments in my head, the way my mother had stopped asking about my projects, how my father only called when bills were due, how my sister never learned my work schedule. None of it had felt dramatic at the time. Just gradual. I pulled out my phone and opened the draft of a message I'd written months ago and never sent. It explained my company, the contracts, the valuation. I read it once, then deleted it. Not out of spite, out of clarity. They weren't confused about me. They were comfortable minimizing me. The announcer began calling departments alphabetically. Applause rose and fell in waves. I smoothed the crease in my gown and reminded myself that this moment didn't belong to them. Still, as I watched families stand and cheer, a quiet question surfaced. If your own parents don't recognize your growth, does it still count? The answer came faster than I expected. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't family. It was the event coordinator. Please be prepared. You're up first. I stood when my roll was called and followed the line toward the stage. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother finally spot me. Her expression shifted. Not relief, not pride, just surprise, the way you look when something misplaced suddenly appears. She leaned toward my father. He glanced over, then looked away again. No wave, no thumbs up. I told myself it didn't matter. But walking those steps alone felt heavier than I expected. The applause around me sounded distant, filtered through layers of air and disbelief. I shook hands with faculty members who knew my research better than my own parents did. As I crossed the stage, I imagined what my family was probably thinking. She made it. Good for her. Now back to real life. That was the version of me they understood. I returned to my seat and watched more names pass. My sister stood to take photos of herself during someone else's moment. My mother adjusted her scarf. My father checked his watch. They were waiting for the ceremony to end. They thought this was the conclusion. For a second, I almost believed them. Maybe this was it. A degree. A quiet walk. A bus ride. A sister with a luxury car. Parents who had already decided where their pride lived. The feeling was sharp but contained. Loss doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it sits beside you, pretending to be acceptance. I folded my program carefully and placed it under my chair. Then the dean returned to the microphone. "And now," he said, pausing as the room settled, "before we conclude, we have a special recognition." My name appeared on the overhead screen. Not small, centered, and I felt the air in the stadium change. I didn't stand right away. I waited for the second announcement, just to be sure. The dean repeated my full name. The screen behind him displayed my academic record, my research citation, and a line that read, "Youngest valedictorian in program history." Around me, people turned. Some smiled. Some whispered. A woman 2 rows ahead nudged her husband and pointed. I rose slowly, smoothing my gown the way I had taught myself to do in meetings. Calm body, steady breath. From the VIP section, I finally felt my parents' attention land on me. My mother's mouth opened slightly. My father leaned forward. My sister stopped recording and stared at the screen. They hadn't known. Not because I hid it, because they never asked. I walked back toward the stage, the applause louder now, layered with curiosity. Halfway up the steps, I caught my reflection in the glass panel beside the podium. I looked composed. Inside, I felt something settle. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was alignment. The version of me they had dismissed was standing under professional lighting, being recognized by people who had read my work, evaluated my data, and signed off on my results. As I reached the podium, I noticed security shifting closer to the stage. Standard protocol. At least, that's what it looked like. But my phone vibrated once in my pocket. A single message from my attorney. "We're ready when you are." And for the first time that day, I understood that this moment wasn't about being seen. It was about what was about to be released. The microphone was cool against my fingers. I thanked the faculty. I acknowledged my department. I kept my voice even, professional, exactly the way I spoke in investor calls. From the corner of my vision, I could see my parents standing now. Not clapping. Calculating. They leaned toward each other, whispering. My sister lifted her phone again, trying to capture the moment from a better angle. That's when it clicked. They weren't proud. They were repositioning. I had seen this behavior before. My father scanning rooms for useful connections. My mother adjusting stories depending on who was listening. My sister stepping forward whenever attention shifted. Recognition changed their posture. Suddenly, I was no longer invisible. I was an asset. That realization landed quietly, but it rearranged everything. I finished my remarks without mentioning family. I spoke about resilience, about showing up when no one is watching, about building things that don't require applause. People nodded. Some took notes. Behind me, the screen transitioned to my professional profile. Internship placements, research grants, startup accelerator acceptance. Information my parents had never bothered to learn. As I stepped away from the podium, applause followed me back to my seat. I didn't look toward the VIP section this time. I already knew what I would see. They would be planning how to insert themselves, how to rewrite the narrative, so my success became theirs. It wasn't new. What was new was my awareness of the pattern. Humiliation hadn't broken me. It had clarified leverage. My phone vibrated again. Another message from my attorney, this one with an attachment. I didn't open it yet. I waited. Because timing, I had learned, is everything. I didn't go back to my family after the ceremony. I exited through the faculty corridor and walked into a quiet conference room the university kept for visiting executives. I closed the door, set my bag down, and finally opened the attachment my attorney had sent. It was a preliminary forensic summary. Not about my company, about my parents. Months earlier, when my mother started asking for larger transfers to help with your sister, I had routed the money through a separate account and asked my legal team to monitor how it was being used. I hadn't accused anyone. I had just documented. The report was concise. 3 pages, highlighted line items, unusual withdrawals, payments routed through a trust one wasn't listed on but had partially funded, property deposits that didn't match declared income, including the apartment my parents claimed they were renting. They weren't renting. They had purchased it, with money that originated from me. The Mercedes my sister had been posing with, also not paid in full. The down payment traced back to the same account my mother said was for groceries and utilities. I closed the file and leaned back in the chair. This wasn't emotional anymore. It was administrative. They hadn't just minimized me. They had leveraged my silence. Outside the conference room, I could hear celebration echoing through the hallways. Somewhere nearby, my parents were probably telling strangers how supportive they'd been. My sister was likely editing clips for social media. None of them knew that every transaction had been logged, that there were timestamps, that intent could be demonstrated. I sent one message to my attorney. Proceed with the audit request. Then I picked up my phone and finally checked the voicemails my mother had left earlier. Her tone had changed. She wasn't dismissive anymore. She sounded urgent. I didn't return the calls. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and prepared to walk back into public space carrying information that hadn't surfaced yet. They thought the ceremony was the turning point. They were wrong. The next morning, I arrived at the investor briefing early. Not to impress anyone, to observe. The conference suite overlooked the river, all glass and neutral colors. Assistants moved quietly between tables. Security checked credentials with practiced efficiency. My name was already printed on the agenda beside words like founder update and strategic outlook. I took my seat near the head of the table. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed. My mother, then my father, then a message from my sister, were downstairs. I hadn't given them the address. Someone had. I didn't answer. Inside the room, partners filtered in, people who had reviewed my projections, challenged my assumptions, and still chosen to fund me. They greeted me with professional nods, not familiarity. Respect built on numbers, not DNA. I preferred it. My attorney slipped into the chair beside mine and placed a slim folder on the table. Property trace confirmed, she said quietly. And the trust structure? It's not clean. I nodded. Outside, through the glass, I could see movement near the elevators. Raised voices, a security guard gesturing calmly. They were trying to bypass protocol. I opened my laptop and began my presentation. Revenue growth, market expansion, regulatory positioning. I spoke steadily, while my parents argued with building staff over access they assumed they had. No one in the room noticed. That was the difference. Here, I wasn't someone's daughter. I was the person with the data. Halfway through my update, my assistant sent a discreet message. They're asking to come in. I typed back 3 words. Follow policy exactly. Then I advanced to the next slide. Because power doesn't rush to meet chaos. It waits for it to exhaust itself. They didn't leave. Security later told me my father insisted there had been a mistake. My mother tried a softer approach, explaining that they were family and that I had simply forgotten to update the guest list. My sister attempted to record the exchange. None of it worked. Inside the conference room, I finished my presentation and opened the floor to questions. A partner asked about compliance risk. Another asked about international expansion. I answered both, then nodded to my attorney. She stood. Calmly, she explained that a routine internal review had identified irregularities connected to personal accounts linked to me, that an independent forensic audit had been initiated, that certain assets were now under temporary scrutiny pending documentation. No names were mentioned, no accusations made, just process. Across the table, investors exchanged brief looks. No one panicked. This was familiar territory for them: risk management, containment, verification. Outside, my parents were escalating. My mother demanded to speak to a manager. My father began calling people whose numbers he had saved years ago and never needed, contacts who suddenly weren't answering. My assistant texted again. Your mother is asking why her card isn't working. I didn't respond. The audit flag had already propagated through the system. Access restrictions don't announce themselves. They simply activate. Minutes later, my sister sent me a message. Did you do something? Dad says the bank froze transfers. I read it once, then archived the thread. Back in the room, the meeting wrapped with polite applause and calendar holds for follow-ups. As people gather their folders, one of the senior partners leaned toward me. Good call getting ahead of it, he said quietly. I thanked him. Professional acknowledgement carries weight because it isn't emotional. As I stood, my attorney handed me her phone. A voicemail from my mother played through the speaker. Her voice was shaking now. Not angry, afraid. And that was when I knew they had crossed from entitlement into exposure. I didn't meet them in the lobby. I asked security to escort my parents and sister into a private conference room on the ground floor, the same neutral space where vendors signed NDAs and disputes were resolved quietly. No audience, no theatrics, just walls, a table, and documentation. When I entered, my mother stood up immediately. Amanda, finally, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There's been some kind of misunderstanding. My father stayed seated, jaw tight. My sister leaned against the wall, phone in hand, Already recording? I nodded once. Then I placed a slim folder on the table. Inside were transaction summaries, property records, vehicle financing documents, a flowchart showing how funds had moved from my personal account into a trust one wasn't listed on. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply pointed. "This is the apartment," I said. "Purchased 8 months ago." My mother blinked. "This is the Mercedes down payment." My sister lowered her phone. "This is the transfer you labeled groceries." My father finally spoke. "Why are you doing this?" I met his eyes. "Because you used my money without disclosure," I said. "And because you left me on a highway yesterday like it was a scheduling problem." Silence stretched. I continued, clinically. "A forensic audit has been initiated. Your accounts connected to me are frozen pending verification. The vehicle is flagged. The property is under review for ownership reassignment based on source of funds." My mother reached for my hand. I stepped back. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here to inform you." My attorney slid a document across the table. Formal notice. Next steps. Deadlines. My sister started crying. My mother began explaining how hard things had been. My father tried to reframe it as a misunderstanding, as support, as family helping family. I let them speak. Then I added one last detail. "The ceremony yesterday was streamed," I said. "Your names were not listed as sponsors or guardians. Legally, you have no claim to my professional earnings." That landed differently. They weren't just losing access. They were losing narrative control. Security waited outside the door. I gathered my folder. And as I stood, I realized this wasn't the collapse yet. This was just the release of facts. By the next morning, news of the audit had leaked through channels my parents didn't control. Social media buzzed with murmurs about questionable property transfers, trust irregularities, and a luxury vehicle tied to unexplained funds. Their carefully curated image of supportive, successful parents began to fray, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Friends and relatives called, not to console but to clarify. Neighbors asked awkward questions. Someone even posted a comment under my sister's Mercedes photo. Interesting timing. My parents' reputation, built over decades, was unraveling in the very public spaces they had used to display pride. I arrived at the office that morning to a conference room full of colleagues and investors. They didn't comment on the family drama. They only glanced at me, eyes acknowledging the quiet control I held over every variable. My phone buzzed continuously. Lawyers, auditors, banks, but I didn't glance at it. I let them handle the chaos I had already anticipated. Later, I walked past the cafe where I had ridden the bus yesterday. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered around my parents' social posts. Their attempts to spin the story into sympathy fell flat. Comments called out inconsistencies, gaps, and timelines that no explanation could cover. Inside, my sister peeked at the office window, her phone recording yet again, but no one paid attention. By the time my parents realized the true extent of exposure, legal notices were already in motion, liens and repossessions quietly being processed. And I watched. From my seat at the head of the table, I observed the collapse not with triumph, but with precision. Every reaction, every panicked call, every flailing attempt to regain control confirmed what I had known. Restraint, preparation, and timing carry louder consequences than noise. They hadn't been publicly humiliated by shouts or confrontations. They had been dismantled by systems, documentation, and truth. And I hadn't uttered a word. Within days, the ripple effects became undeniable. The apartment my parents had claimed was legally transferred to my name. The Bentley they flaunted, repossessed, flagged as purchased with funds traced back to me. Any attempts to access accounts linked to my transfers were blocked by formal freezes and audit holds. Their calls and messages flooded in, frantic and pleading, but I had already routed them to my attorney. Socially, the collapse was equally visible. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues began questioning discrepancies they had once ignored. My sister's social media posts, once a source of curated envy, were now examined with skepticism. Invitations to family events stopped arriving, replaced by silent whispers and awkward distance. Through it all, I remained composed. Every step I had taken, the quiet accumulation of proof, the deliberate timing, the restraint, was now actively dismantling the narrative they had tried to control for years. The legal and social dominoes fell exactly as anticipated. Yet I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. Victory, I had learned, is far more potent when it is observed, not announced. A week later, I called my attorney into the office for one final briefing. On the table lay a folder I had kept untouched, contracts, correspondence, and a clause buried in my parents' trust documents that no one had noticed. It allowed me to claim any unallocated assets tied to their ventures, retroactive to the date I had first funded them. I opened it slowly, pointing out each detail, each line of accountability. My parents had never thought to audit themselves, never considered that their own child might have structured protection in advance. The Mercedes, the apartment, even portions of previously shared investments, all traceable back to funds they assumed were freely theirs, were now fully secured under my name. My sister, who had thought she had a head start, realized too late that every advantage she had relied on had been temporary. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No confrontation. The systems I had set in motion simply executed themselves, silently and irreversibly. I looked at the folder, closed it, and leaned back. The last piece of leverage, the one they never knew existed, was now mine, quietly ensuring that every move they might make in desperation would come too late. I didn't wait for their calls or apologies. I didn't post a single word online. The apartment was mine. The vehicles were reclaimed. The trust flagged. My sister's social media had lost its luster. My parents' public persona, meticulously curated for decades, was quietly unraveling. All of it documented, irreversible and legally binding. I packed my laptop, folders, and notes. Every system I had built, every sequence I had controlled, had worked exactly as intended. I left the office with nothing more than a simple tote bag, walked through the city streets as if returning from a routine meeting. People nodded, unaware of the storm that had passed. The power silently consolidated in one calm, deliberate presence. Victory, I understood, doesn't need noise. It doesn't need celebration. It doesn't need justification. The impact is in the aftermath, in what unfolds when systems operate without fanfare and truth outpaces narrative. I reached my car, slid in, and for the first time in years, exhaled fully. The best revenge, I realized, isn't anger. It's control. And I walked away,